Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Sanaz and I'm the Events Director for the Behavioural Economics Society, and I'll be running the panel today. I'll let the rest of my team quickly introduce themselves.
Hey guys, I'm Michelle, studying economics at UTS, and yeah, really excited to have Lionel and Will on our panel today, both esteemed experts from academia and industry. So yeah, thank you, and thank you for everyone who's joining us today.
Yeah, hey, I'm Tom. I'm with the behavioral economics team. I study economics as well, and I'm just super excited to see what's going on in the industry.
Hello everybody, I'm Davina and I'm the secretary of this society, and I study economics and I'm quite interested in behavioural economics and applications, and yeah, so I hand it back over to Sanaz.
Thanks guys. So from our last Job Truth panel, we learnt that behavioural economics is a new and growing field where research is playing an integral part in the discovery of new concepts and applications. Because the field is so new, there is room for a lot more research, and it constitutes a large part of the behavioural economics field. So here we wanted to compare two different career paths in research and industry, both which are very important roles, and to give you guys more insight into the real world applications and consequences of behavioural economics. So to introduce our amazing speakers today, firstly, I'd like to welcome Professor Lionel Paige, who is one of our own UTS academics, and whom some of us here have had the honour of being taught by. Lionel received his PhD in 2007 and in 2016 won the Economic Society of Australia's Young Economist Award. Lionel has written numerous research papers. He's had his own TED Talk as well, which I'd recommend you guys check out. And I would also like to welcome William Mahler, who is the head of the Behavioural Economics team at the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. Prior to joining CBA, William established and led the PwC Behavioural Economics team, whom our previous speaker, Jason Collins, is from. So now without further ado, I'll jump straight into the questions. In this first section of questions, I'll invite Lionel for you to answer first, and then I'll pass the same question on to William. So the first one is, what do you do? How did you end up where you are now? And what did your career path look like?
That's thank you very much, Saras, for the invitation, and I'll try to convey a few insights to the participants. That's a very big question. So what do I do? So apart from teaching things like the grad cert in behavioral economics, I'm a researcher. So I'm asking myself, it's a job I like very much. I ask myself questions. I'm quite free of designing the questions I want to answer. Obviously, if I don't ask interesting questions, my colleagues are not going to read them. And I'm trying to find data, either existing data or experiments, to answer the questions. And typically, I'm very interested in how people make decisions, and the consequence of that. So I publish a lot of papers on questions about people behavior alone or in organization, in strategic settings. So that's my job. I spend a lot of time in front of my computer writing things and doing stats. And then how did I come to that? So as you pick up from my accent, I'm French. And I followed a training which is very, very specific to in France. They have this training system which is very broad initially. So I was trained broadly in social sciences. I did sociology, history, philosophy, in addition to economics. And then you choose quite late what you want to do. And initially I was telling to Will that when I was first introduced to economics, I was not too keen. It was not, there was all these toy models, this curve of utility. And that was pretty much at the start. You enter in economics and they tell you, well, we assume that people have these indifferent curves in their head, and then that's how they choose. And that sounded to me very strange and unlikely. In particular, given the other things, I was reading books in sociology about how people behave, and that sounded very interesting and very deep. And at the same time, I was having the economic courses, and that didn't sound very deep. And so I was very unsatisfied. But I think one of the big events to me was I followed a course in 2001 by Mohamed Abdellaoui on risk and decision. And there I read an article for me, I think it was really a turning point. I read the article by Chris Tarmer in the Journal of Economic Literature on the research on decision under risk. And this article was fascinating because I had until that point only followed courses which were very abstract and not really we didn't have any discussion with reality. And in this article, which is 75 pages long, you know, it's kind of a tough one, but it reviews all the theories, experiments testing the theories, showing that the theories often do not reflect how people behave, and then how people came up with new theories, which led to new experiments, which led to, you know, new tests and potentially new invalidation of theories and new theories. And to me, that was science. So, you know, I mean, having people telling me that there is indifference curves and people choose these weird models without at any time looking at reality or data, that sounded strange. But in this course, I discovered that there was this area in economics when there was, you know, this scientific approach. And basically, as I went further and further in research, that's what economists do in research. And often, I'm not sure how it is now, but often when people in my generation, at least, when we were taught economics, there was not much data. It was not grounded in empirical things. And so as I discovered more and more the ability to do this discussion between having theories, having tests with experiments or with statistics, and I did a specialization in statistics afterwards, I think I found it was fascinating because I didn't believe the initial theory, but I could see how to test it. There were new theories. They were better at explaining things. We could test them, and if they didn't work, we could think about new theories, etc. And so that's how I came up to be very interested in behavioral economics, and I chose that as my career.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lionel. William, I extend the same question to you.
Great. Can I just start by saying thank you to Emma, Sanaz, Michelle, Tom, and Delina. I really appreciate you having me. Excited to participate in the event tonight. And thanks to the UTS team more broadly. Absolute honor to share the stage with Lionel tonight. Big fan of Lionel's research. I've followed him for a long time, and also good friends, but great to be with you. And hopefully I can help out tonight with any questions. Please think of some tough ones for later. There's some similarities in Lionel's story to mine, I think, and also obviously some differences in where we've ended up. I studied a Bachelor of Economics some time ago now, and I kind of enjoyed it, but I also had a lot of questions around the pure economics degree. I carried this into the workforce pretty quickly thereafter. I became a retail economist, and my job was to help large retailers like gyms and supermarkets to find good locations where they could get a lot of traffic and a lot of business, and to work with local governments to understand economic impacts. A lot of the models we used obviously had a lot of limitations. There was a lot of unanswered questions around consumer behavior with that job. I left there and I kind of took a little bit of a career turn, and I went into more of a corporate role where I was designing incentive programs for large sales workforces. Some of these salespeople were very well paid, which was a little bit crushing on a graduate salary to see these big numbers. But again, I could see there's something that was quite unanswered in that work as well. I could see I could make large changes to how much a salesperson would be paid and have very little impact on their behavior. But then small changes seem to have outsized effects on how these salespeople behave. And I wasn't quite satisfied with my economics training. So I came home one day, I started doing some research. I started reading some weird books. Behavioral economics wasn't really a mainstream thing at the time. And I found myself, funnily enough, in Nottingham playing soccer. So I was on a soccer tournament, and there's a large behavioral economics and experimental economics research center in Nottingham. Funnily enough, Lionel mentioned the professor that I organized lunch with when I was up there, named of Chris Starmer. So we were inspired by the same professor in a funny turn of events. Chris took a look at these strange books I'd been reading and talked to him about where my career was going and how my economics degree hadn't really answered a lot of the questions I had. And he was running the Centre for Decision Research and Experimental Economics in Nottingham at the time. He said, why don't you apply to come and work with us and do a master's program? So I did, quit my job. I moved to England. I studied with Chris and the CDEX team while I was in Nottingham, and absolutely fell in love with the field of behavioural economics and experimental economics. I brought that back to Sydney. This was before Nudge or Thinking Fast and Slow or Nudge Units or any of those things were really a thing. And so here I am in Sydney with this strange degree that no one else has, thinking, what the hell am I going to do with this? Am I going to be able to get a job? Bit of a crisis. I bumped into a partner at PwC. He said, why don't you come and see if you can start a team? So I went into consulting and we started talking to clients and talking to partners, and we slowly started to establish this behavioural science unit within consulting in Sydney. So at the time, one of the first in the country. Very, very scary. No playbook. Often the weird guy in the meeting. What is this guy talking about? But very quickly, some of the gaps that I'd found in my previous careers, I was able to better understand those and better explain those for clients. We were able to ask smarter questions of data, ask smarter questions of businesses, bring in research and run trials that really shone a light on some areas for a lot of our clients that they hadn't really looked at before. We got some results. Lots of things didn't work. I almost got fired a number of times, but largely it was successful. This is where I met Jason Collins, for those of you who were on the previous call. I hope he said nice things about me. But really enjoyed my time at PwC consulting. We worked with obviously government units. We worked with health businesses, financial services, not-for-profits, charitable organizations. Incredibly fulfilling time there. And then in the last few years, I was approached by a large financial services organization who has the purpose to improve the financial well-being of Australians. If I was to think to myself, where is an area where I can have a lot of positive impact on a lot of people, it would probably, for me at the time, it was a large financial services organization, seemed like a really, really exciting prospect. I've been here ever since and completely happy with the move. I can talk a little bit more about this later in the call, but we do a lot of work around understanding how Australians make financial decisions and use financial products. And with that understanding, we inspire new types of opportunities and products and experiences for customers. And we test those and we measure to see if we can actually have positive impact on customers and communities. And if we can, then we can scale that up and have a broader impact. So that's how I got to where I was. It may sound very linear and organized in retrospect. It certainly wasn't. It's a really nice series of accidents, I would say. But great to be here. It certainly wasn't all by my own skill or creation. I've had a lot of, it's worth saying, I had a lot of really good mentors along the way, including Chris Starmer and many others. I've enjoyed top-down support in a lot of the organizations I've worked in, which is really important for this type of work. And I've had incredible team around me in most of these jobs. So really excited and happy to expand on that later if it's helpful. Thanks, Inez.
No, thank you. So Lionel, back to you. We've sort of answered this question a little bit, but what is your education background and what part of your studies or your degrees do you find you're using the most or were the most useful?
So it's difficult because I think I find useful the fact that I had this broad training in social sciences initially. So I did a lot of sociology, for instance, which isn't common in economics, and which gave me all the views, and it made me initially more critical about the teaching I got in economics. Actually, I was in a cohort, it's funny because I was in a cohort of, there is a special section in the French system doing this kind of thing. It's actually the same section that Esther Duflo did, you know, the recent Nobel Prize. She had this, and you can see from her research, she was also very, you know, she was doing history, philosophy, etc. And I guess it influenced her outlook on economics. And so I like that because I think I started with maybe a more diversity of views than, you know, if you just do economics and you follow the training. But afterwards, I think what I really like, as I said, there was this training in decision under risk, which may not seem very fancy, but that for me, that was the first time where I encountered economics as a scientific process. And that was fascinating. I could question theory with data, experiments. I was actually, my teacher was an experimental economist. And so I participated to experiments. So I was in a room and choosing between lotteries, and he was using that to publish research. That was fascinating. I really enjoyed that. And then after, there's two other things that I did. I did a research master and I did econometrics. And then once again, it was not in experimental economics, but it was about looking at using data to test ideas. And here again, I was faced with something which looked like science. And then finally, I did a specialization in statistics, which was quite, how to say that, in depth for me. It was quite, it's a real specialization in statistics, which involved having some training in mathematics. And I was not a mathematician. I mean, I was always, in my training, I always did some mathematics all throughout, but this really had to follow a foundational course in mathematics and in statistics. And that's at another level was very interesting because it really helped me get a deep understanding in statistics, which is, you know, mathematics it's often like, I don't know, difficult and obscure, but when you do more, eventually, you know, mathematics is about making connections, and so it gives you a grammar to read about things. And then for me as a student, really, it's a lot of the opaque veil on research was lifted when I did this specialization, and it's not for everybody, but me, I really enjoyed it. I think it was very, very useful.
Perfect. Over to you, William.
So what did I like or what did I find useful? There's a little bit of overlap there, I think. Look, I think Lionel and I were speaking about this off camera earlier. I think an economics foundation, an incredibly biased perspective here, so please take this with that caveat. I think an economics training gives some incredibly powerful mental models, and it's hard to see them at the time. I remember sitting in the Macquarie Theatre a long time ago thinking that some of these ideas were too abstract and never going to be useful. But economics training and economics mindset are really powerful mental models that I think I've really enjoyed having through life, and it helps you to see things a little bit differently. Simple concepts like if you look at Economics 101, understanding opportunity costs and trade-offs and second order effects, budget constraints, particularly in the job and the industry I'm in today, these things are incredibly important to pull apart problems and understand them better, and to eventually get to solutions. I think I've really enjoyed kind of seeing that come into application. I also, as Lionel said, I really enjoyed my experimental economics training. Chris Starmer was one of the better professors in the world in this space, and I was very spoiled to have the lab around me that I did, but very much enjoyed that. Very much enjoyed game theory, and more specifically behavioral game theory. Again, incredibly powerful mental models that have been useful well beyond the program and into my job and in life. So I think these economics tools have provided a really good grounding. The ability to write and pull apart research papers, these aren't things I'm strong at, but these are things that are really important in an applied and a practitioner role. And so opportunities to get practice in doing that and learning from good researchers like Lionel and his team will really kind of carry well into any kind of practitioner career as well. An extension beyond that is then industry experience. So being able to actually take a lot of these tools, understand how a corporate or a government thinks about them, and to be able to translate what you know into what's practical and important for them. I think that's an incredibly important skill for anyone that wants to be a practitioner. It's also very rare and very hard to develop. It's certainly taken me a long time. But again, blessed to have a team around me that's also very good at that. I might pause there, Sanaz, but I think very much enjoyed the economics training and the behavioural and experimental training as well.
Perfect, thank you, William. Last question for this section is, what does a regular day in your life at work look like? Do you have a routine, or is every day different? Lionel?
Yeah, my days, I don't think every day tends to be a bit different. I mean, a day at university for an academic, and I'm at the end, you know, at the career ladder in academics. So I'm privileged that it's less stressful than when you enter academics nowadays. It's quite, you know, there's a long path of postdoc or tenure track, or when you have to publish to make sure that you don't, you will get a continuing position. So I'm not in this. So for me, it's less stressful than for more junior academy. But so, you know, there's different things. There's all the teaching, obviously, which I can guess you can imagine, preparing coursework, delivering, etc. There is all the organizational aspect, which takes a big chunk of your university time. In particular, when you're professor level, they ask you to, you know, to take leadership. So I'm the director of the postgraduate studies in the group. I designed the grad cert, and we are now in the process of designing a master. So that takes a lot of time, you know, spend a lot of time in committees. So that's one thing as well. And then there is the research. So with the research, there's a lot of working with colleagues, discussions. At the moment, they're all on Zoom, but otherwise, you know, talking about ideas. And then otherwise, writing papers, which is an interesting process, and doing the analysis itself. So either, you know, you could be designing an experimental study, running the statistics, and writing. That's what it is. So it's yeah, that's the way it looks. Lots of time on my in my office, and lots of time talking with people.
Perfect. On to you, William.
Yeah, I was going to say 12 Zoom meetings back to back for 9 hours. That's pretty much the standard day at the moment. I think one of the scary things trying to come into the practitioner field is there's no playbook. There's not kind of a model of how to do this in corporate world or in industry. So that was incredibly scary, and we've kind of built it as we've gone. But we're slowly kind of getting to a bit of a structure and a bit of a typical, I'd probably say year rather than day. We have some extra constraints, I guess, that academia doesn't. Maybe we have some extra freedoms that academia doesn't as well. But at the start of if I say at the start of a year, I'll sit down with other behavioral scientists in my team, the senior staff. We'll look at what the business strategy is and the purpose of the group. We'll look at what our team's specific capability is, where we think we can kind of add disproportionate value to the business and take the business forward. And we'll effectively propose projects to the business, get support from senior leaders. Often that includes funding and endorsement and sponsorship. We then will often, depending on the problem we're looking to solve and the program we're setting up, we'll bring together, I'm very lucky I've worked in large organizations, very well resourced, so we'll pull together a team of effectively the experts we need to solve the problem that we've proposed. This includes internal and external experts. We have a panel of academics, external practitioners, community groups and not-for-profits that we work with as well. We're very lucky to have a high quality and large internal team of data scientists and designers and experimentation experts. So really we'll identify a problem really worth solving, propose it to the business, hopefully get it approved, bring together this team of experts, develop and execute a program, which will often involve pulling the problem apart, designing one or more interventions or treatments, testing those, and ultimately either publishing with an academic partner or writing it up for an internal audience and presenting it back. If that all goes well, we get invited back next year to do it again. But that's typically what a year looks like. I feel it's a service for me to say that there is a lot of, it is often big parts of the day are like a job. So there's lots of meetings, there's timesheets, there's bosses and performance reviews, and a lot of the stuff we all love about working in corporates and companies is still there. But it's also, I feel very lucky to work on some kind of big community and national problems and to be able to work with internal experts. Thanks, Inez. I'll pass back to you.
Thank you so much for that, William. So I'll just move on to the second section of questions. Lionel, this one is for you. So from an academic's point of view, in your opinion, what are some of the up and coming areas in behavioural economics and potential areas of, and are there any areas of research that you see, there's some like gaps in the knowledge that, that requires some more research and work?
That's a good question. In research, it's hard to, I think I could tell you about research areas which I think are up and coming, but I think that's maybe not the most interesting for you because they're far away. They're far away from, what would matter for you. Except if you do a PhD, but that's I'm not even sure, I know exactly what they can sound a bit esoteric if I was to talk about that. But I can say what I think is maybe in the broad picture about behavioral economics in the industry, behavioral economics out there. I think what you had is that you had several phases for behavioral economics. You had this phase where behavioral economics was mostly in academia, and that's when I was trained and when Will was trained as well. And so at that time, behavioral economics was a bit of a fringe area. Nobody knew much about it. 2001, there was the Nobel Prize by Daniel Kahneman. And then the Nudge book arrives, I think, 2008. Yeah. And that had a big impact. And then you had the 2010, I think, book, Thinking Fast and Slow from Daniel Kahneman. And then you had also the book by Ariely of Predictably Rational. And then, you had all these books making behavioral economics quite fashionable and in broad public. You had also the book Freakonomics, which kind of was a precursor to, it was not behavioral economics, but it was economists talking about real life, using data and examples to show you how economics is useful. And so all that, between when we were trained, I think, Will was saying that when he arrived in Sydney, it was not clear what kind of job he would get with training behavioral economics. But now there's a lot of, a big interest in behavioral economics. But I think that in the process, the behavioral economics that has caught up mostly in industry, there's a bit of a delay. And so if you look at, Thinking Fast and Slow, that's Daniel Kahneman talking about his research in the 70s and the 80s. That's quite old. So when I read Thinking Fast and Slow, having been a researcher already in this area for quite a while, I thought that was interesting, but that was almost kind of archaeological. That the field and the research and the questions that we're working on now are by nature, not necessarily ahead or different, that we, you know, the thinking fast and slow is not the day in life of a researcher now in behavioral economics. And so what you have in the industry is that you have this big interest in behavioral economics. Lots of people have read these books, but they are, I could characterize that as the first wave of behavioral economics, which is a psychologist, mostly psychologist, criticizing economists. And I think that behavioral economics that Will was trained with Chris Starmer, which is great, and the economics I did is a bit different. It's like the economic field, as in some way what happened in economics is that there was this wave in the 80s, 90s of criticism, and even before, criticism from the standard models by psychologists, etc. And initially, when I started as a student, that was a fringe discipline. Like the economist mainstream was really resisting this idea. It was like, you know, we were a bunch of rebels, and so we were not clearly in economics. It was this kind of, you know, some economists would have said that was not economics. But as we move now, everybody is happy with behavioral economics. Like behavioral economics is really part of the mainstream. Like you could be a labor economist and you would not say you're a behavioral economist. But as you get your data and you think about the data, you would use behavioral economic ideas because they're just part of the toolbox. So now you don't have something like economics and behavioral economics. You had a fusion, a merge of the two. And what you have is that behavioral economists maybe are those more interested in looking at behavior, but they use standard economic tools. And then the standard economists are maybe just people who don't focus on looking at behavior, but, you know, usually a labor economist or a development economist is going to be very happy to use behavioral tools when they need. And so I think you don't have this dichotomy, which you have maybe in an industry. And in particular, I think that one risk that you have is that the people who have never heard about behavioral economists and they read Thinking Fast and Slow and Nudge, they think that there is this thing and it's totally separate and you want to be a behavioral economist and that's not economics or that's not standard economics. And that's kind of the view of 10 years ago or more. But I think if you get that, I mean, I think the future is you get people more who are really economists, who have understood the weaknesses and the limitations of the standard models of 15 years ago. But then now we have new models which kind of integrate the insights from psychology, but we retain a lot of what was in economics, standard economics of 15 years ago. We retain the good things, and we abandon the simplistic ideas from 15 years ago. And now if you look at the new generation of researchers, that's what you have. You have more and more very interesting models which when you get this fusion of the two approaches. If I was to give an examples, for instance, and I think Will has released this profile and the outlook he has in his work is a reflection of that, is that if you want to think of consumer decision and regulation in the term of finance, you want to think with the tools of economics to think in terms of, you know, how people react to incentives, questions of asymmetry of information, all this kind of thing. And you have a contract theory, and you have very powerful insights from standard economics. But then you have this field in economics now, which is called behavioral I/O, where you can merge these insights from standard economics with looking at when people don't behave like pure computers, like, you know. So you can, okay, let's use the insight of the standard, but considering that people, you know, maybe they have some limitations. Maybe people don't read all the information you give to them. Maybe if you give too much information to them, they're not going to look into it. But then you can still have models and think about what are the consequences of that. You don't throw the baby with the bathwater saying, I'm not doing economics, I'm just doing psychology. And I think that that's also very much the philosophy of the grad search, is that some people think that behavioral economics is psychology looking at economics. But I think that really the behavioral economics in research and the way we design the grad search as well it's a syncretism, which is a fusion between the good ideas from before and the new insights from psychology, which makes a new way of doing economics, which is much more powerful and much more insightful. And I think that when you do that, you know, behavioral economics is much more than just writing letters and changing words and nudging people. And the nudge thing is just one area which is very popular and very much discussed when you use psychological tricks. But the training in behavioral economics is really being an economist, understanding how people really behave, and that's what it is. Yeah. So my view of behavioral economics and how it's going to evolve in the industry is that we want more of this kind of thing. People, we're not just doing psychological tricks to influence people and get them to sign on time or buy your product, but really somebody who is an economist understanding human psychology.
Perfect, thank you, Lionel. William, this one is for you. Similar to what Lionel, I asked Lionel about potential areas of growth and employment in behavioural economics. And also we've got quite a few of the graduate certificate students here tonight who might be using the, Catherine, who might be using the course to upskill, expand their skill sets. So I guess I'm just looking for your opinion on the need for using more behavioural insights in jobs in all industries.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Inez. It's interesting that, and I do this myself, and I hear it a lot as we use the words behavioural insights and behavioural economics, behavioural science quite interchangeably. I wanted to pick up, I really liked Lionel's point of first understanding economics and then understanding how psychology can enrich economics. And again, I'm bringing my bias here as an economist, but understanding how people under perfect conditions or with perfect capability should behave, which we could call economics, I think is a really good starting point for then understanding when to bring in psychology and when to understand that that's not happening in real life. And I think a lot of business is, we can think of a lot of business as like intuitive economists. So if I put prices up, people should buy less of something. If I pay people more, they should work harder. If I give more information or more choices, that makes a consumer better off. And economics tells us those things. But then we see that that's not exactly how it happens in real life all the time. And to be able to identify that and say that normative or perfect situation isn't playing out, I think is a very powerful starting point. So I often talk about finding anomalies. And if you can find systematic anomalies, that's very powerful for a company. That means you've got an opportunity to change something at scale if you can understand it, explain it, and effectively intervene. So again, just my plug for economics there and the power of having those mental models as a starting point to then understand when psychology is important to bring into that. So I completely dodged the question there, but I'll come back to it now. I think, so Naz, it was around people in the program looking at how to apply behavioural insights to their work. Is that right?
Yeah. So I guess your opinion on it, yeah.
Yeah, so I think I often say that the blessing and the curse of behavioural economics is that it applies in so many places. And I've got no doubt most of those on the call tonight will work in industries or companies or participate in communities where behavioural insight, science, economics will have very important application. I'd like to, I think there's kind of the early mover fields. So we see finance or financial services and health as really early movers in application for practitioners of behavioral science. I think obviously government units now, I think I heard today there's over 200 behavioral insights units in governments around the world today. So lots of application there. I know they're moving now. Lionel mentioned kind of the tweaks to text messages and forms. I think that's become very, very popular, but now we're starting to see a lot of these units move into more complex spaces like tough crime or domestic violence or even things like climate change or problematic gambling. I think development economics and a lot of not-for-profits around the world, there's a lot of interesting, important work going on, particularly around kind of cross-cultural applications. And then the next wave, I think we're really seeing a lot of exciting crossover spaces. So behavioral human resources, behavioral risk, behavioral marketing, behavioral law, you name it. We're seeing really interesting examples, certainly not mainstream, certainly not mature, but both from the research and in practice, we're seeing some really interesting emerging spaces there as well. But I think wherever you've got human decision makers making important decisions, there's going to be application for this field.
Perfect, thank you, William. Lionel, another question for you. Given your extensive experience and work in research, what is your advice to someone who's maybe looking to pursue a PhD or to go into research similar to what you do? It could be for anybody who's studying economics or business or studying in like another field and wants to put a behavioral spin on what they're looking into.
So if you want to do a PhD, so I think, you know, when you want, someone you want to, one option is to try to go to work in academia, and that's a PhD is for that, mostly. You can do, obviously you can work in the industry, but it's quite costly to do a PhD to go to work in the industry, given that you're going to be, you know, working for 3-4 years at a much lower wage than you would get if you were in the industry. So I think first I'd say that before I answer the question about the PhD, I think that personally I value both options very well. I think you can see from the description that Will is giving that his job in the industry is really a problem-solving job, and I have worked a bit. I did a 3-month stint in a hedge fund in London, and my experience was the same, that it was a lot of problem solving, which is quite exciting. And so you use your skills to answer problems. There's a big difference between the industry. I mean, there's lots of differences, but one of the big differences is the time and how you select the problems. Basically, in academia, you solve problems which you think are interesting and you think other people in your field will find interesting. You have to convince other scientists that it's interesting. Sometimes you have this kind of fashion, like what is a hot topic that people care about? And obviously, I mean, big world problems tend to be more interesting, but some problems are really abstract and, you know, they would not interest anybody else apart from the scientists. We are convinced that it's a very important problem. So that's the way the problems are selected. Like, that's just whether your peers like the problem. In a firm, as Will has described, you know, it's like, do you get support to spend resources which are scarce to answer the problem, which is time, which is money to answer the problem. So do you get your boss to say, yes, you can work on that? So clearly, usually the problems need to have an outcome to improve the monetary, the financial prospects of the company. So that's the kind of way you select the problems. So you don't end up answering the same problems, but that can still be very interesting. And then you have the time horizon. I mean, when you work in a company, usually you have to have something, you know, within a month or several weeks, maybe several months. Well, when you work in academia, I work on problems which, you know, I mean, I got a paper published in 2019. I started working on it in 2009, right? So that's the time horizon is much different, which is great if you are not super stressed, but, you know, maybe the progress in some cases can be a bit slow. So now if you want to do a PhD, so I'm just saying that because I don't think that one way is better than the other. I think, you know, it's perfect. And that's what I would say to my kids: do what you want. I think there's plenty of ways to do great stuff in the industry. And you have lots of very smart people going in industry and choosing not to do academia, and you can resolve lots of very complex problems. I mean, when you look at companies like Google and particularly in finance, they absorb a lot of very talented people who could have done a PhD. But then now, if you want to do a PhD, then typically you need to do an honors program in Australia or a master by research, which are the two ways. And then you have, I think, if you really want to get an option to get academia, it's very difficult. I mean, and it has got more difficult. I must say it has got more difficult and a bit less appealing. As a consequence, there's a lot of competition, which means that the pathways initially, you know, you did a PhD, then you get a continuing position. Now, often for up to 10 years, sometimes you can have, you know, a postdoc, first postdoc, a second postdoc, and maybe a tenure track position, where the tenure track is a position where for a few years, you just have to, you're on probation. So you have to show that you are doing well and publishing. and eventually your position is either going to be confirmed or you're not going to be confirmed, then you'll have to find another job. So that's quite uncertain. And in particular, when you're young and you think of building a family, that's kind of something which it can be difficult. And when you have partners and you have to decide where to locate, etc., this aspect of academia has become a bit more difficult. But then if you really want to do that, you do a master by research, you do an honors program in Australia, and then you have the option, if you're doing very well and you're really motivated to do research, one option is to go to the US. So Australian universities are really good at doing that. We write very good letters to our best students in honors and master by research. And, US universities, if you want to do research, it's the best way to get a PhD from the US. I shouldn't maybe say that, but that's the truth. It really helps to do this thing, to go to the US, and these PhDs from very good US universities are very well recognized. And so we are recognizing this fact, and we encourage and support our students to do that when they can do it. But, you can also do a PhD in Australia, and we have very good students here to do PhDs here. We have at UTS, we're one of the few universities in Australia who has a doctoral program, and we have a very good training, and also we support our students. It's a very competitive market to get a job eventually in academia. We have been fairly successful until now. So one of our students got a postdoc in NYU Abu Dhabi. Another one is working in the Melbourne Institute on labor economics. And another one was in China, got a job in China. So that's the thing. I think the Australian route for a PhD is maybe a bit easier to get a PhD in an Australian university. It's also, I guess, less difficult than going abroad. And the most ambitious one, which is a big challenge, is to go abroad. That's the way to do a PhD, to get a chance of getting an academic position.
Perfect. Thank you, Lionel. William, a question for you is, what is your advice to someone who is looking to pursue maybe a graduate role or apply for a behavioral economics role, like in consulting, sort of similar to what you do? What qualities do you think employers are looking for? Is there certain experience or education that would be really beneficial to have?
Yeah, good question. Firstly, it's probably worth saying that we've been hiring now. We've been looking to hire since the team was established here in Sydney, and we've had a lot of difficulty finding local talent, to be really candid. I often say that my first 6 recruits into the team came from actually 5 different continents. So historically, we haven't had the programs in Australia or the experience or the background as much as perhaps the UK or some other geographies. I'm really excited to say it looks like that's now changing, and there's some really exciting both organizations and formal training programs and credentials starting to emerge in Australia. I'm really particularly excited about the UTS program. Working with Lionel and seeing the program, it's very strong, and it has a lot of elements that a team like mine would certainly highly value. I'm always reluctant to give anyone kind of advice on exactly what to study or what experience to get without understanding their own ambitions or their career prospects or objectives, I should say. You've heard me say on this call already that I always highly value in my team a really strong base knowledge of economics. If I was running a behavioral science team or insights team, otherwise a strong grounding in social cognitive psychology or anthropology or sociology, those core groundings and core disciplines is always going to be very, very valuable. From there, as a practitioner, it's always also going to be really helpful to have some industry experience in the particular industry we operate in. So there's no real general advice on how to become a behavioral economics practitioner without understanding what type of practitioner do you want to be. And I would put that back to your audience. Do you like consulting? Do you want to work in a corporate? Do you prefer government or not-for-profit? Geography, cross-cultural work. Are you more quantitative or qualitative? These are questions I think that your audience, I would suggest, ask themselves first before, I guess, trying to develop this kind of generic behavioural economist title. It's almost like work backwards. So where in the world would you like to have impact in understanding human behaviour and being able to change that in positive directions? Where would you like to go with that? Which part of the supply chain would you like to operate in? Would you like to work with the data, or work in field research, speaking with people, or work with senior executive stakeholders? These are all questions I think the audience could consider. I always ask, if anyone ever asks me for career advice, I don't give it. I always ask them to look at the books that they read for fun, and that's probably a direction that might be quite telling for you. And who are the people you admire? And I think once you've got that, the skill, the people skills that we would look for are kind of a deep curiosity, a fascination with human behavior, kind of a humble mindset that our team certainly doesn't have all the answers, a persistence. A lot of stuff we do doesn't work, or we spend 6 weeks preparing it and it doesn't launch. So a real persistence is helpful, comfort with ambiguity. And I think one of the differences between academia and industry is this kind of versatility and being able to switch between contexts very quickly. I think you don't have the luxury of time often in a practitioner sense to follow a project for a very, very long set of time. So yeah, curiosity, kind of humble, persistent, and comfortable with kind of a volatile work focus, I suppose.
Thank you. That was really insightful, William. The next 2 questions I pose to you both. So for someone who's wanting to gain more knowledge about behavioural economics, do you have any recommendations of resources that someone can access, such as certain academic journals, papers, and reading books, aside from Nudge and Thinking Fast and Slow, which I do have right there for product placement. So this could be for someone who's currently studying behavioural economics or just has a newfound interest in the subject.
I don't know. Do you have books? Will, I always struggle with this question. Do you have books to recommend in behavioral economics?
Yeah. Well, I started reading a lot of Gerd Gigerenzer. I started in some strange places, kind of a lot of anthropology. But Lionel's already touched on the big ones. So the big blockbusters for economics, Predictably Rational, Thinking Fast and Slow, Nudge. There's worse places to start, I think, than Nudge and Thinking Fast and Slow. They're both Nobel Prize winners. So you could start. There's worse places you could start reading. I liked. Probably a good thing to do would be to read or watch the Nobel Prize acceptance speeches from Thaler and Daniel Kahneman. They give a really good summary of how their research developed and how they got to where they are. I wouldn't just read Nudge and Thinking Fast and Slow. Go into the references. Find the parts that you're particularly excited by and interested in, and go deep. Go into the references. Go into the links. There's some incredibly good work that's come out of the field over the last 50 years, I guess. It's very broad, so follow it. And then I think the other thing I would say, and Lionel may add to this, is try to find some contrarians or some counter evidence in whatever you're reading. I think the the most interesting people I know in the field today are the ones that ask the tough questions of a lot of the popular stuff. In particular, if you read Thinking Fast and Slow, some of the research in there is actually now dated and not replicating well. So always take, be very skeptical of what you read, ask lots of questions, and really avoid kind of getting in these behavioral science echo chambers where I think where we all just agree that everything's the popular books are just truth and we all agree with them. I think try to avoid that.
Yes, I'd add to Will. I think I can't find a book because, as Will said, when Will and we were trained, the research which is described in Thinking Fast and Slow had already been done a while ago, and so. When I was reading Chris Starmer, or when Willis was trained by Chris Starmer, that's already kind of, I don't want to say that's better, but just, research keep moving on. And so the research has still moved on. And so I think there is not at the moment, I don't know books which are easy entry, which kind of convey the depth and richness that you can get in research at the moment. So that's a bit of frustration. And one thing, for instance, one thing you can read is the blog by Jason Collins, I think is great because he has done the research and he's very, as Will said, he's critical. And so you will see Jason is clearly interested in behavioral economics and believes in lots of, he's working as a behavioral economist. But he's also critical of the fact that some of the results don't replicate and some of the ideas were not as solid as we thought. So that's one example. I would have loved to be able to tell you that I finished my book, but with the COVID-19, I'm a bit slow. So my book is still, I'm writing a book, which is, I still have to revise the first draft. But in this book that I'm writing, I'm trying to do that. I'm trying to kind of, and the book is written a bit tongue-in-cheek. The title is called Optimally Rational, which is a kind of an answer to dynarily predictably irrational, because I want to argue in this book that lots of the biases, that there have been an overemphasis on biases. I mean, and Will was mentioning Gerd Gigerenzer. Gerd Gigerenzer had the paper which is called the bias, is the fact of seeing bias everywhere. And so as soon as you see a pattern of behavior, you think that there is a bias behind it. And I think that lots of the economics research recently has been to try to understand why people don't behave as we think they would behave if they were rational computers. And some of the explanation is that, people make mistakes, or maybe they face cognitive limitations, so they can't solve like hard problems with lots of information. But sometimes also we discover that the truth is that people are really good at solving the problems they face, and we didn't understand exactly the problems they were facing. So for instance, if you have informational, if treating information is costly, then you will use shortcuts, but maybe you will use very efficient shortcuts which are going to work most of the time very well and allow you to make quick and fast decisions. But sometimes they will fail. And actually this explanation is you could find these kind of ideas in Kahneman, but in Kahneman and in the first phase of behavioral economics, the emphasis was to criticize standard economics. So the emphasis was to stress on biases, to say, guys, your model is wrong. So there's a lot of biases. And now the emphasis is not so much on biases, it's more like trying to understand what we call a bias may actually be just a kind of an instance where a good rule of decision, which works most of the time very well, if you look at a very strange, a very unusual situation, then it's going to misfire. A good way of thinking about that is visual illusions. We have visual illusions because our perceptual system, our visual system, is designed to be very efficient to not to treat all the information, but to use tricks to retrieve the important information to make very fast decisions, because you have to treat a lot of information if you think of all these pixels, all this stream of flow of information that you have to treat. So your brain and your receptors are going to use simple rules to extract from this complex information what it needs to make the good decisions. But then the simple rules are going to work most of the time. But if you get a psychologist designing a weird drawing, which you never face in real life, and put in front of you, maybe you're going to start seeing things moving when they're not moving. But that's not necessarily a problem. That's not a problem. You're designed to face the real world. In the real world, the way you design is going to work well. So I think that's where we're moving now. We're trying to understand why people behave the way they behave, and often there are very good reasons for that. And that's what I'm working in the book. And I think there is not enough of that out there. And I think you'll see more. My book is clearly not going to be the only one on this thing.
Perfect. Thank you. Did you have anything to add to that, William? Or
I was going to say follow Lionel on Twitter. I think that's a really good way.
He has some good posts, I will say.
Yeah. There's some, as you were talking, there's a good paper, I think it might be by Colin Camera, on behavioral economics, past, present, and future, which is a pretty good summary. And I think there's a follow-up paper revising it as well. But I think that's a good summary of a lot of the research over the last number of decades. Lionel, are you aware of that paper?
No, so who is the author of this one?
Maybe Colin Camera, George Lowenstein. I have to check. Maybe I could forward it to the group. I'll find it later.
Is it a recent one?
No. Although I think there was a revision more recently. Yeah. Let me dig it out. I'll send it to the team.
I think maybe there is a difficulty as well because behavioral economics is merging with economics. It's harder somehow to write something about behavioral economics. I mean, behavioral economics was very distinct when, it was a group of researchers who were unified in their criticism of the mainstream. But then now, as everybody's accepting it, it's harder to describe where behavioral economics is going because it's much more intertwined. I mean, the fate of the ideas in behavioral economics is much more intertwined with the broad area in economics. So you could ask, more. And I think, Catherine, there was a question in the chat, will behavioral economics become the political economy of the 21st century? I think that, maybe what you'll see is that we all eventually talk less of behavioral economics as such and more of economics. And the average economist will have more understanding of behavioral concept. I mean, you'll still have an area of behavioral economics which is more focused on kind of the microeconomics of decision, etc. But when you look at research, you open journals and you look at the papers, you will find papers which do not distinguish whether something is and which, for instance, take an idea from behavioral economics and write a very standard model showing how this behavior makes sense when you put the right hypothesis about the problems that people face.
So we are starting to run short on time. So we've got about 20-ish minutes for the Q&A. So I'm just going to pass this over to Davina, who will go through our chat and we'll get some of those questions you guys have asked going.
Thanks, Inez. So I'll give everybody who's written a question in the chat an opportunity to unmute their microphones and ask either William or Lionel directly if they wish, but say after 5 seconds. If you don't do it, I'll just read out the questions. So Ben, if you want to personally ask your question, feel free to unmute yourself.
Hey there, great presentation, Will and Lionel. Lionel, the question was for you. You talked about you're predominantly a researcher. My question was, if you could research any question with Will in a banking context, in financial decision making, what would it be?
I think it's so many. I mean, we have talked with Will. I mean, one of I discovered from this discussion as well that we share this interest, this common interest in Chris Tamer work. Chris Tamer worked on the formation of decision and trying to understand really how people make risky decisions. And that's really at the heart of financial decisions. You decide to burn investment, an insurance product or whatever. You have to choose between different options with different risk and opportunities. And how people make these decisions, whether they make mistakes or not, whether their decisions are follow good principles or not. This is really what this area of behavioral economics is about. And so I think there's so many interesting questions. I think one interesting thing is, one of the interesting things that when you work in the industry, you have access to huge data with people making real decisions. So, me as an academic, usually, I mean, I can get these data sometimes, but often when you do experiments, and like what Chris Stummer was doing, or when Will was in Nottingham, you'd put, 20 people in a room, and you get people to answer some stylized questions. And then you do that 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, you get 100 participants. And then you can do statistics to see whether the type of questions you ask, how it changes people's behavior, etc. That's very interesting, but obviously you have small samples, and you can always have a question about whether, using students in this kind of unusual setting is going to tell you something, how much informative this is for real life. Well, in the industry, if you have a database of your customers and they're like, I don't know, 100,000 people making real investment decisions. So that's interesting. What if you find insight here, that's right away obviously relevant for the real world. The drawback of that obviously is that because you do not shape, you do not design how this data is formed, you have to take it as it is. So in the experiment, you can design the question the way you want to get really clear-cut answers that you want, and in the real world, typically, you don't have that. So you may find that the data doesn't allow you to answer the questions you would want to ask. But I think there's so many things to do. So I mean, we've talked with Will about that, and I'm sure we'll eventually we'll get to sit together and do something. There's plenty of things to do.
Very elaborate answer. Thank you for that, Lionel. Luke, you also have a question for Lionel in the chat. If you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sure. That was a really interesting answer, by the way. Thanks for that one. So yeah, Lionel, I just wanted to follow up on one thing you said, which was how you mentioned that there were like waves of behavioral economics, and thinking fast and slow was an example of the first wave. I haven't actually finished the book, but I've read a lot of it, and I think it's pretty interesting. I just kind of wanted to follow up and find out like what were the waves since that first wave that you would describe, and like how would you sort of describe them, I suppose? So
there would be people less that you would be less aware of, because there would be, as you get closer from the frontier of research, they become more and more esoteric. I mean, clearly I would say in the post, so Kahneman and Thaler and Ariely, they're in the first wave. Even if Ariely is pretty young, Ariely is a psychologist mostly. Kahneman was a psychologist. Thaler is an economist, but really he's kind of almost half a psychologist. He was in Chicago, but not in the Department of Economics when you had the hardcore economist. He was in the business school. When you typically economists in business school interact a lot with psychologists in management and marketing, etc. So these are the first wave. They were the guys who were like Don Quixote fighting against the citadel, which was very difficult. And I don't want to in any way sound disrespectful. I think they were at the time economists didn't want to hear them, and they moved the field in the right direction. But then the fields moved, and there's this expression which comes from Max Planck, which is that the field doesn't change because all scientists change their mind. It's changed because all scientists die and new scientists comes with new ideas. And I think what you have is that it's not that the behavioral economists have changed the mind of the old economists, it's that you have new generation like me coming up, and it's like, okay, that's what I want to do. And then I'm not even the newest generation. You see the new generation now, they don't even think that, behavioral economics, that's the same thing. So they have this common view. So if you wanted to give you a few names about what come after Kahneman and Thaler, etc., well, you'd have economists like, for instance, Rabin. He was for a long time in Berkeley. Now I think he's in Harvard. I'm not sure. But you have these behavioral economists like Matthew Rabin, who tried a lot to build models to explain, to formalize the ideas from behavioral economics. So you had Matthew Rabin. I mean, you could say that Ernst Fehr was a bit the same in the area of social preferences. You have these guys. If I wanted to say, afterwards, well, I'm not sure how detailed it should be, but what you had is you had really kind of almost two schools. You had the behavioral economists who try to build new models when you often kind of tweak a bit a standard model, adding a parameter, etc. That's a school of Maturabi. In another school, you have the decision theorists who try to look more at foundational principles, changing foundational principles. These are more the people like, I think we put maybe Krishnammer in that, maybe even if he's not fundamental theorist. But my teacher, when I started, Mohamed Abdelawi, does that as well. So it's asking, how do you, not that you change a toy model, but how do you change the foundational principles? And that was, I would say, maybe a second way. But then now you look at the newest economists, the youngest economists, and they're just merging everything. So, you know, I would say, I would give you a name, for instance, like you could Google him, like he's very young, he's a rising star in the field. His name is Strack, Philip Strack. He's German, he's in Berkeley, I think. You look at his papers, and there is no frontier between behavioral economics or not. He's clearly modeling using behavioral economics and using very standard tools. His papers are really quantitative, like hardcore, mathematical. But when you understand mathematics, really what he's doing is trying to merge the two tools. Like if you think about how people behave in complex situations, he's going to integrate in the model the fact that people are not perfectly rational in the sense that we were using before, but taking that into account, how you can make predictions about what's going to happen, how people are going to, the strategy of people are going to interact with each other, etc. And I think that's what you have now, this new wave, and people freely use concepts from behavioral economics, try to understand more why people behave that way rather than in the previous way, and there's not this opposition with things. And I think we are from that getting a lot of insights, in particular in fields like organizations, I/O, consumer decisions. It goes way beyond psychology because we retain so much insight, very, very important insights from economics when you think about asymmetry of information, for instance, and people reacting strategically when there is asymmetry of information. And then you take into you plug into these models the fact that people have behavioral limitations, like treating information is costly, etc. You get insights which go, you know, and it's not a criticism of Daniel Kahneman or whatever. It's just that, you know, Daniel Kahneman, his most famous paper was published in 79. Like 79 is, you know, that's great. That's one of the most, I think, the second most quoted paper in economics. But 79 is a very, very long time ago. And the field has built on that and is now much further away.
Cool. Thanks, Lionel. Annabelle, you have a question for William, if you want to ask that.
Sorry, it wasn't a very deep question at all. You were talking about PhDs, and I was just asking you whether you actually need PhDs or masters or whatever to be a practitioner.
I guess Will should answer that, right?
Yes. Sure.
Yeah. Thank you for your question. The answer is no, I would say. It probably depends. There may be other behavioral science teams, if you speak to their managing director or their lead, that may have a different answer. But for the work we're doing, I don't think that level of research training experience is necessary. Not to say it wouldn't be helpful, but I think that the kind of the qualities that I touched on earlier. So to have a good grounding in one of the social science disciplines is certainly an advantage. So whether that's economics, or if we're talking, let's talk at the behavioral science level, social psychology or sociology or neuroscience, to have that grounding and awareness is certainly not going to hurt. To understand the scientific method is also going to be an incredible advantage. To understand how to read and assess and critique research is also an advantage. It sounds like I'm describing a PhD here, so I'm going back on my answer. but there's other skills that are really going to be required as well. So I talked about kind of industry awareness and empathy for the types of industry problems that you're going to be working with. The ability to project manage and work with lawyers and marketers and regulators and risk experts. Comfort with ambiguity and noise and versatility. And Lionel talked about the perfectly controlled environment of a lab. We don't have that. So skills that you'll learn in a PhD, I think it will depend on the institution you're at, but they're often geared towards setting you up to have a long-term successful research career in academia. It depends on the institution. Lionel could extend on that answer. But for us, a solid grounding in one of the behavioral disciplines, appetite and kind of enthusiasm to learn, versatility for a noisy context and switching context, and that humility that I talked about and persistence, where we don't know all the answers. A lot of stuff we do doesn't work, but we're trying to develop strong insights that can apply to business and society. I hope that answers your question, but
thank you very much. It does.
The short answer is there's certainly roles out there where you won't require a PhD. Yep.
Thank you.
Michelle, you also have a question about coronavirus, which is very topical right now. So if you'd like to ask that.
So I guess this kind of stems from conversations that I've had with, my family. My brother is, in medicine. He was, we were watching the news, and I guess we were making the analysis that, the way that governments, made their predictions based on, how many cases there were, and therefore predicted, I guess, the rate of infection. So it was much higher than the actual R that kind of eventuated in real life. And we were kind of reflecting, my brother's girlfriend, she's like, even before the lockdowns happened, I ended up, driving to work because I knew that, I want to protect myself. And then people are concerned about, how their actions might affect other people. So then they therefore might social distance before lockdown. So, given that the epidemiological models that, were used by governments to kind of lock down, obviously in some way, or not obviously, but in my perception, was missing an integral kind of insight from perhaps, economics or behavioral economics about how people actually make decisions. So I was interested to hear, from both speakers, what your kind of perceptions are. How do we get these two fields talking to each other? If they are talking to each other, how do we get it, I don't know, in a more constructive way, and how would that ideally look like in the future? I guess I'm just curious, because obviously there is a need, but we're not there yet.
Lionel, I might answer really quickly, and I'll pass to you.
Sure.
Just very quick. I actually thought that the whole coronavirus crisis situation was an incredible celebration of science in a lot of countries, and then not so much in other countries. To see kind of chief medical officers and scientists and epidemiologists kind of front and center in a lot of the press briefings, I thought it was really nice, instead of just politicians. And you can see the countries that actually listened to the scientists did actually fared very, very well. So I thought generally for science, I thought that was a really nice kind of celebration and acknowledgement. I think in terms of behavioral science, you're going to see an explosion of literature coming out over the next 6 to 12 months. There's some papers already coming out now, incredibly quick research. If you were to ever have a kind of a behavioral science situation in society, and Lionel is an expert in kind of natural experiments, with businesses being shut down, people being told when and when not to shop, and at scale, governments requiring people to work from home, wash hands, switch behaviors, kind of change behavior at scale. I think this is really an unprecedented situation. And while I say that the science was good probably on the medicine side, I think the question's a really good one, because there's a lot of behavioral science that perhaps we weren't ready for, perhaps the media gave bad signals, or perhaps we could have done things slightly differently, but it was an incredible situation. And I think we're going to see a lot of really interesting both commentary and research coming out of this period. I think fascinating time in history for behavioral science. Lionel.
Yes, I think, Michelle, your question is a really good question. As it happened, I discussed that a bit on my Twitter account as well. But it shows the importance or the usefulness of economics as a discipline. The epidemiology is a discipline on its own, and there are things which are that economists don't know. But outside of economics, too often we don't take into account how people change their behavior. And people are not just automaton where they're not just like little robots, and you tell them something, and they continue to behave the same way as before. And so the models of epidemiology on which they were the forecasts, you have, for instance, and I looked a bit at these papers. You had some papers which kind of assume that in Australia, in the case of Australia, you have a paper. We had a paper who simulate the population of Australia, and then you've got they compute how many people, how infectious is a disease, and then they simulate people meeting other people, and then that simulates the spread, and then you get the curve, and then eventually the curve peak and decrease, and then you apply some lockdowns and some kind of rules to limit people interactions, and you see how this curve is flatter. And obviously one thing, if you think as an economist and you look at that, you say, wait a minute, if you tell people that if nothing is done, there'll be like 100, 200,000 people who are maybe sick in 2 weeks, well, people may not, people will change behavior. And so the model itself, as soon as you publish the model out there and it's in the headline in the news, then your model is not going to work anymore. Actually, that's a very old critique from the 70s. It's called the Lucas critique. That is, when you do economics, as soon as you do a model, if your model is used for policy, and then people hear the policy, then the model itself, people are going to react to this model prediction. And then your model is not, you need another model to understand how people react to your model. And so when you're right, if you look in the case of Australia, even before the Australian government asked us to do a lockdown, many people who could started social distancing. You don't go to work as much as before, or when you are in public spaces, you're more careful, even if the government has not edicted guidelines, because you're just aware of that. And you and everybody else changing their behavior is going to decrease the R used in the model. And so what you had is that all these models were really interesting. In some way, they were reflecting the worst case scenario, which obviously is not going to happen. I mean, it's not uninteresting because you want to tell people if nothing is done, that's the worst case scenario. That's why you should change your behavior. But in some ways, often the news and even the scientists in epidemiology fail to present it that way, because they fail to appreciate how much people would change their behavior. And so obviously, eventually, the horrible prediction don't eventuate, and then people say, oh, science is wrong, etc. But I tweeted about that. I mean, I think very early on, saying that you could hear some people saying we may have to stay in lockdown until September, and I was quite skeptical of that, because I'd seen people changing the behavior, and maybe in particular in my field of work, when you have much more work from home. So I think you're right, and as Will said, the science is moving very quickly, and you have already plenty of economists who are working with epidemiologists, and you have new papers coming in. And then these new papers do this merging when you say, okay, you have the dynamics from an epidemic, how does it work, which comes from epidemiology, but you have the models about how people react to risk and uncertainties, and that comes from economics. And then you have very sophisticated models already, which says, what should a government do, given that we know that even if the government doesn't do anything, the people are already going to adapt their behavior. We know that they're not going to adapt their behavior optimally because you have, this concept of external negative externalities. So, I care about myself, so I don't want to take too much risk. But maybe if I'm 20 something, I think I don't have much risk. And so I'm going to go in a nightclub, not factoring in that when I go out of the nightclub and I'm sick, I'm going to give it to somebody who is going to give it to his grandma, and the grandma is going to die. So I'm not taking into account in my this cost, but at a social level, we should take that into account. And maybe that's why we should close the nightclub, even if the 20-something people are not going to die from the virus.
Sorry, so, Lionel, to cut you off.
Okay, sorry, I'm too long. But I'm just saying that these new models are coming in when they merge economics and epidemiology.
Thank you. I think that we could have a whole panel just discussing this one question about coronavirus and behavioral economics. But yeah, thank you so much for those comments, and I'll pass it back over to Sanaz.
Yeah, so that wraps up everything that we have time for today. I'm sorry that we didn't have time to get through all the questions, but we did have some very insightful answers from you both. Just on behalf of our team, I want to say thank you to everyone for being here, for coming, and a big thank you to Lionel and William. Your time is really, really appreciated. So yeah, big thank you to you guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks.